Hi, this is Greg Penny, and you're listening to the Your Morning Coffee podcast with my buddies Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart. It's the weekly music news for the new music business.
This week, we turn our focus to Billboard's latest deep dive, the distribution revolution.
And amongst that, music distribution, how it works for labels and streaming.
Streaming platforms as distributors. Does it work?
Music distributors for indie artists, how to pick the right one.
Independent distribution tips, advice, and FAQs.
And top music distribution companies. Jay, I don't know if we've ever had such an action-packed episode.
It's a lot.
Is this. My desk is strewn with notes. It's going to be exciting. But boy, we have to talk about this stuff. It is super important. We are glad you're here, we being Jay and myself. So yes, kick back, relax. This is going to be a very exciting episode. And this is the Your Morning Coffee podcast. And we are going to get started right about now.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand!
Your morning coffee is on the air. 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 On the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
My goodness, Jay, it has been a week. Our week ended on such a high note.
Oh, my gosh.
We were together all day yesterday, which was a rarity for us.
Yeah. We got to have a little lunch. We got to spend some time in the studio with a couple of legendary producers, and we had our friends from Apple come and join us, and we listened to some amazing music, some amazing spatial audio, Dolby Atmos mixes. It was the highlight of my week, highlight of my month.
Yeah, it was so fun. And it was, of course, at Greg Penny's studio. And nearby is Bruce Botnick as well. So we got to hang with both guys, which is legends in the business without a doubt.
We'll talk a little bit about their pedigree. You could talk for hours, but
sure. But in the realm of spatial audio, Greg Penny did the first Atmos mix for music, and he did Rocket Man from Elton John. He and Elton John go way, 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 way back. They have been friends forever, and he was actually at the recordings of the Goodbye Yellow Brick Road album as a just out of high school. Actually, his family was friends with Elton, and so he's worked with Elton for decades, and of course that track, Rocket Man, in that mix really kicked the ball down the field and got everybody in terms of the DSPs interested in spatial audio and immersive audio. And so we just got to hear some of the stuff that he has been working on. And then, of course, literally across the parking lot is Bruce Botnick. And Bruce Botnick, if you don't know, amongst other things, he was the engineer for Beach Boys albums. He's been around the business forever, but of course he's remembered for so many different things, but amongst them are the Doors. He engineered the first 3 albums, and as we heard yesterday, Paul Rothchild was the producer of those first albums, but he was in a relationship with Janis Joplin when she died, and he was so distraught and not really liking the songs they were working on that he said, I'm not gonna not going to participate on this next album. And then so Bruce took over as producer of that. And so we were up there a time back, and we were listening to some of the Doors immersive tracks. And there is nothing... you can't compare when you're listening to it yourself, but when you're listening to the guy that was in the studio with the knobs over the console talking to the guys in the band at the time in 1967, 68, 69. And you talk about a legend, and he was the engineer for Good Vibrations, so amongst some pretty iconic stuff. So it was a fun day.
It
really
was.
fun day. And then after that, I went and saw Bruce Hornsby live, which was another.
How was that?
Nice thing. It was fantastic. Yeah,
cool.
I'm a huge fan. So
awesome.
Fun stuff, Jay. Fun stuff. But we've got so much to talk about. And like I said, my desk is strewn with notes and things we're going to cover. But this Billboard deep dive that they did was absolutely fantastic. So we're gonna get to that in a second. But of course, we couldn't do the show, Jay, without the lovely help of our sponsors, and we are so fortunate to have sponsors to help us put this show together, including, of course, our friends over at Bandzoogle, built by musicians for musicians. Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform that makes it easy to build a beautiful website and EPK for your music. All the features you need for a professional website are already built in, hosting a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates, tools to sell your music and merch commission-free crowdfunding and fan subscription features, mailing list tools to grow your fan list and send newsletters, social media integrations, and live support from their musician-friendly team 7 days a week. Your Morning Coffee podcast listeners can go to bandzoogle.com to try it free for 30 days and use the promo code Morning Coffee, which is all one word, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. That's bandzoogle.com, promo code Morning Coffee.
Your Morning Coffee podcast is also brought to you by Hypebot. Since 2004, actually, Hypebot has chronicled this new music industry, all the trends, technologies, changing how music is discovered, consumed, marketed, and monetized. It's edited daily by founder Bruce Houghton with help from Alana Bonilla. Hypebot and sister blog Music Think Tank are published by live music discovery and marketing platform Bands in Town. And speaking of Bands in Town, over 65 million live music fans trust Bands in Town to get personalized concert alerts, recommendations, and messages from their favorite artists. It's the #1 artist services platform, connecting over 550,000 artists with their superfans. Managers, labels, agencies, and artists access their own dashboard to manage and promote their tour dates across all platforms. So thank you so much to Hypebot, Bands in Town, and our good friends over at Bandzoogle.
Yes, indeed. And by the way, there's a couple of things I want to talk to you about, Jay, before we get started on the whole distribution thing. Great article, again, in Billboard on Crunch Digital and Temp. And I know you know Crunch Digital, Keith Bernstein over at Crunch Digital.
Yeah.
And what an interesting article talking about licensing songs for startups with this platform called Tempo. And boy, it is so... I don't think everybody really appreciates how hard it is to get the important information about ownership of masters, ownership of publishing when you want to license songs. It is not... We've been in the business forever, and it's really hard for us to track that information down. Imagine just the general public that wants to do some licensing. This really is a wonderful tool to get that information easily and quickly.
Yeah, it's a game changer. I've known Keith for over 20 years. This Billboard article, by the way, was written by Kristen Robinson, and the headline was, "Industry Veteran Wants to Make Licensing Songs for Startups a No-Brainer with Tempo." And it's, the kind of the subtext here is Crunch Digital's Keith Bernstein on empowering new businesses to know more about proper licensing. He says music has value and music is undervalued.
Yeah. But not only that, you had a chance to chat with him.
Yeah, I did. After the story the Billboard story went out, I spoke with Keith this week about it. In fact, take a listen. Keith, thanks for joining me today. I have a couple questions for you. It feels like we're entering in a new era in this music business where we're frequently discussing fairness as it relates to how songwriters are paid, the overall value of music as it relates to other businesses and products. For example, Peloton. You've been a pioneer in this space for decades. Talk about the progress you've seen since the A&M days.
I really don't think, if you measure progress by revenue growth, I don't think there's progress in that regard. I think we've regressed. If I go back to 1999, 2000, around that time, things were rolling, but you could see what was coming. And I think that we're fighting for better rates. I believe the leverage sits more with the DSPs. It's not as much where it used to be with the labels and publishers. But what's ironic about that is these services wouldn't have a service without the music. So, I think when you look at the valuations of some of these companies using music, that we would progress if we can just really get a fair share of what we should get. And that's what I know the NMPA and others are fighting for. And I wish we could make that number even bigger because it deserves to be bigger. But right now, I just think that we just, for some reason, don't hold the cards to really get what we deserve in terms of valuing music and the rates.
So this week in Billboard, I was reading about you and about a platform you're launching called Tempo. And the way that I see it, and correct me if you see this differently, is it really helps to simplify a process that can be pretty daunting to somebody outside of the music industry. If you're looking to license music for your business, a fitness app, for example, you can input a list of tracks into Tempo that you'd like to license, and the platform will give you information about the labels and publishers and what you'll need to do to get your request approved. Is that somewhat accurate?
You got some of it, so we're going to make sure you get a free account so that you can actually use it, and we can straighten that out. So here's what I saw as what was missing, and I think it's great that now you're talking about the MLC and they're building databases, and there's more authoritative databases, and people now can maybe find who they should license from. Okay, we're getting at a good place where we can start finding people, but what I saw is missing, and a minute ago, you mentioned Peloton or companies like Peloton. Here's what's so interesting. When you look at a lot of the infringement cases and you look at a lot of, the lawsuits going on, many of them involve companies who already have a bunch of licenses. And it's like, well, hold on, they're licensed. What's the issue? The issue is that when you get these licenses and you get these large catalogs of music, that's where some of the problems now lie, that the companies who have these licenses can't figure out what they can or cannot use under their deals. And when you're talking about a couple label deals with maybe 7 publisher deals, how is a company going to, on their own, put together the collective song shares, across songs and see if they have 100% and are they cleared on the label side? So what we saw was missing was a tool where people that have existing licenses can actually confirm whether or not they can use the music under the licenses that they have. And to the extent that a song comes up as not available, then they actually get the information to know who's missing, what wasn't licensed. So Tempo really, becomes that needed tool gateway to allow people to know in advance whether something they want to use is available under the licenses. And that's where I felt, the solution was needed. A solution was needed.
Awesome. Thanks for the clarity, Keith. Thanks for joining us. So after this story went out, Keith received over 5,000 visits to his LinkedIn page and countless emails.
That's what happens, right? If nothing else, that is a testament to the importance of this, of having these tools, and of course, making it easy for folks to license music. And of course, we've talked a lot about, how licensing of music has been such a gigantic element of profitability for all of these music companies, and how that is continuing to grow. And that was always an element of things when we started in the business, but that just continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger as the Pelotons of the world, which is the one that kind of gets mentioned often at the moment, but there will be others, and it's a wonderful tool. And he's been kind of doing versions of this for a very long time and working in this space. And it's dense, baby. It is dense, and anything to make that process easier.
Yeah, it takes this complex thing that is, can be challenging to understand, and really simplifies it. So sign up for Tempo at crunchdigital.com. Yes, indeed. And by the way, when I do this show every week, it is a treat for me because I got to hang out with my good friend of more than we're kind of pushing 25 years, I think, in terms of knowing each other. Good Lord. My buddy Jay Gilbert. He is the co-founder of music and marketing and strategy company Label Logic. He's the curator of the Your Morning Coffee newsletter and a former executive with Universal Music, Sony Music, Warner Music Groups, and Fox Home Entertainment. Not just a pretty face. Not just a pretty face.
The man does not sleep. He does so many interesting things, and he is a groovy dude. And I appreciate it. And we got to hang out almost all day yesterday.
Yeah, that's always a pleasure when you and I get to hang out and talk shop. This guy sitting across from me, Mike Etchart, is a longtime host of Sound and Vision Radio, formerly of SST Records, Warner Music, Capitol EMI, and Universal Music, and really the guy who's opened my mind to all things spatial audio. So I thank you for that.
Yes, indeed. And because Jay does not sleep, he can do even more podcasts than this, including the Behind the Set List with Josh Groban, which is that coming, or did you
it dropped this last week?
It dropped. That's right.
Thank you for that. You know, my friend Glenn Peoples from Billboard, he and I do this podcast called Behind the Set List. And it's just been so much fun to talk to artists about the songs they play live. Like, why do you play this cover? Why do you open for this? And we've had some amazing conversations. Kurt Smith from Tears for Fears, Ani DeFranco, Ann Wilson from Heart. The list goes on and on. Anyway, we dropped the Josh Groban episode this last week. And he's a really, really great storyteller and a hardcore music guy. And then one other podcast I'll mention really quickly. I've been doing the Music Biz Weekly podcast. That's easy for you to say. With Mike Brandvold for, we're over 500 episodes. And there was an episode we dropped this last week that's really interesting. And it was about this story about this band called Walden. And we had their manager and their singer on. They did a 50-state tour. It was 51 dates because they did 2 in California, LA and San Francisco, but they did Alaska, they did Hawaii, and a lot of it was fan funded. You know, they would sleep on couches. They would, one of the things I thought was interesting is on their website, instead of just buy my CD or my t-shirt, there would be an option to buy us a tank of gas. And so they would, take a picture of themselves filling up the tank and sign the Polaroid and send it to the person who contributed. And they had fans that helped them get on planes to Alaska and Hawaii. But it was just a wonderful conversation. So check that out. Walden, it was their Where's Walden tour. And they're such a cool band. And the last thing I'll say about them is on this trip across all 50 states, they had someone who was taking photos and doing video. And they created a video for one of their songs that you can find on YouTube. And it's got some of the highlights of some of that video of them across the country performing that song, and it's just stunning. One of the best videos I've ever seen.
Well, and what made me think of this, because I just finished, as I've mentioned before, the SST Records book, which is fascinating. And that is so much the way all of those punk bands, those LA-based punk bands toured in the 80s, which is the same thing, essentially. So,
what's old is new again.
That's exactly right. It's fun to kind of hear about that sort of seat of your pants kind of touring, and with help, and not that much has changed in many ways. And I tip my hat to those guys, because it's hard work when you tour at that level like that. It's hard.
It is hard work. And you may play for 2 people in a nightclub one night, and then you may play for thousands at a festival the next. And it's hard work, but it can be very rewarding just based on the relationships that you make along the way. Yeah. And I always say the harder I work, the luckier I get. And that's how you find that luck. Kind of a sad note this week, a legend in this music business passed away.
Yes, he did. Mo Austin. And both Jay and I worked in the Warner Music Groups at different times. And safe to say that there probably hasn't been in the entire history of the business, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody more important than Mo Austin was to the growth and the nurturing of artists in the Warner Music Group, Warner Brothers Records, and a guy who started as Frank Sinatra's accountant and came over with Reprise Records when that was Frank's label, but when it got absorbed into Warner Brothers Records, and built arguably one of the most successful record companies in the history of the industry, and not only known for its financial success, but also for its artistic success.
Yeah.
You know, talk about a catalog second to none over the years, and devoted artists to him. And just a remarkable guy, a well-lived life, passed away. I think he was 95.
Yeah.
And a local guy, you know. Yeah. And I didn't realize until I read that I think he went to Fairfax High School. I knew he went to UCLA, and I saw Burt Bacharach at Royce Hall before the pandemic. And you know, that Mo I think had donated about $10 million to UCLA in his name and his late wife's name, and Burt called out Mo at the beginning of the concert, saying, "Well, you know, nice to see you here, Mo." And yeah, an amazing guy. And I got to see him every morning when I worked at Warner Brothers Records, and he was just so pleasant, so nice, and you know, just another legend that has passed. And
you worked pretty closely with several legends in those years. Talk a bit about that. I find that so fascinating. Just that. You know, epicenter of talent.
I was so lucky. I was at SST Records, and you know, I was working for a little indie label, and then I got hired to be an assistant to one of the senior executives at Warner's. And this executive was highly thought of by both Lenny and Mo. So they had his office right between theirs. And there I was sitting in the desk in front. So every morning they would just, you know, they couldn't not see me. And it, you know, I would try to work late, and they would, you know, when most of the rank and file was gone, those guys would come out and kind of sit around. And so it would just be me and this person that I worked for and these two legends. And it was just, you know, I was just so lucky to kind of be in their presence and just be a fly on the wall, which I was. And
I only got to meet Mo twice. One was briefly, and then the other one I was in a meeting with him, and it was a little intimidating just knowing who he was. But he, you know, he calms things down right away. He's just very gentle, you know, very funny, very smart, and he will be sorely missed.
Absolutely. And there's a wonderful piece you can go on the LA Times website that Robert Hilburn wrote, talking and what was unique about him, not only in his skill set and the way he created and ran those companies, is that he was not somebody who tried to get publicity for himself, and in fact did the opposite. He said, you know, my artists are the ones you want to talk to. You don't want to talk to me. And in fact, I don't believe ever really sat down for a full interview.
That's pretty rare in the music business, right?
Yes, it is incredibly rare. And so, but they did, you know, and it's an interesting. There's a good book out on Warner Brothers Records and the rise of it, and you know, it's also tragic to see how it was just kind of let go, basically, in terms of once they got rid of Mo, and how all the things that he built very quickly got changed, you know. And it was a sad thing after Steve Ross's passing.
End of an era.
And but that's the business of music, you know. And things change, and even that changed for the worse. I think it's a shame, but boy, what a interesting and fascinating human being, and
iconic,
well loved,
absolutely,
and well missed.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this week we're going to dig into this Billboard deep dive. It's called the Distribution Revolution, and there's several amazing stories that we want to touch on. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about labels versus distribution. Labels and distributors are frequently used interchangeably, but they're completely different animals with very little overlap in roles and responsibilities. And I want to take a look at the differences. And this is from a piece I wrote for Hypebot last year. But I have to preface it by saying that this is evolving and changing. So what Mike and I are going to do right now is tell you, from speaking and working with labels and distributors, we're going to outline what typically are the roles and responsibilities. But the one caveat here is that this is evolving and changing. all the time. This is not hard and fast. So let's kick it off with you, Mike. Let's talk about distributors.
Sure. So generally speaking, when we talk about distribution and distributors, this is kind of what they typically handle. So they do global digital distribution and monetization. That's fairly straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Both physical and digital product release coordination. Okay. Best practices in troubleshooting across the DSPs and social platforms.
Huge.
Surface insights and analytics on release performance. They pitch to DSPs for playlists and marketing programs. They're involved with content ID and channel optimization on YouTube. They are involved with social media verifications, rights management, potentially pitching for sync licensing. Yep. And of course, pseudo videos, the cover image and the audio bed they are involved with as well.
Right. So that's distribution typically. The only thing I would add to that is I find the value of distribution in the problem solving. That you have someone, if you have a strong distributor, something's going to go wrong. It does. And you need somebody who you can talk to, who can solve problems. And it's very, very powerful stuff when you're dealing with In-Grooves, the Orchard, Symphonic. These are problem solvers, and they have relationships and weekly meetings with the social platforms and with the DSPs. So it's not all about chasing playlists, right? It's problem solving. And also, you touched on data and analytics. Typically, they have a dashboard, and they have internal people that can do analytics. It can be very, very helpful in growing your business. Okay, so Mike just covered distributors. Let's talk about what labels have typically handled. Release strategy and putting together a marketing plan, radio promotion, publicity, whether they outsource it or they do it in-house, sync licensing. Now, we mentioned pitching for syncs in distribution, but most of that happens on the label side. And then you get into creative things like video and photography, advertising campaigns. And although, again, with a lot of this stuff, there is these blurring lines. There's a lot of powerful advertising that distribution does as well. That full digital marketing strategy, online assets, that may include, music videos, banner sets, all of those kinds of things. And then they schedule events for their artists, except for in-stores. Typically, that's handled by distribution. So that just kind of lays the land for what does a label do? What does a distributor do? But of course, as we mentioned, distribution is taking on more and more label roles. Some of them are giving advances. Some of them are really getting involved in helping artist managers and labels with branding and creative and advertising. So there are some distributors that really act like a label, and there's some labels that do their own distribution, which we're going to talk about in a second. But that'll just tee this up.
Exactly. And I do want to mention too, to see where you're going, you have to know where you've been. And, just a quick history on distribution, it's worth mentioning that, when you and I got in the business, of course, there were major label distributors, there were indie distributors, but if you go back even before that, pre-1970, there were record companies and there were independent. They were all independent distribution companies, and they were typically regional. And, back in those days, even when I kind of was a little kid buying stuff, you could buy records at hardware stores. You could buy records at Western Auto. I remember going to the Broadway, which was the precursor to Macy's, to buy records.
And tickets.
And tickets, we talked about that, and tickets as well. And so that kind of was the world of distribution. And then there was another layer in between that. So if you were like a small hardware store in Oxnard, California, let's say, you probably didn't have enough business to go directly to your regional distributor. You would go typically to something called a one-stop. And those one-stops were for small players in the retail business that didn't, again, have the volume to to be able to go to these regional distributors. But that was kind of the landscape that existed. And one of the things that, as I read all of these things, is like you said, and then we grew up in terms of our careers in the major label system. I was in indies first and then major labels, and that was fairly cut and dried as to what they did. And those, of course, came about because around in the very early 70s, some of the larger record companies wanted their own distribution network because they felt they weren't getting the services they deserved or wanted from all these regional indies. And so that's kind of how things got to be where they are today.
Right.
We should also mention, though, that all of these articles that you put in the newsletter and that we're going to be talking about are only accessed through Billboard Pro. And that is an incredibly valuable resource if you're not getting Billboard Pro. I think it ends up being about $10.99 a month. But that gives you a lot more access to the Billboard pantheon of information and stories and things like that. Very worthwhile, though, to have that subscription.
Right. And there's other benefits. There's some really great weekly emails that they put out. One is on kind of the legal beat, one that Glenn Peoples does called The Ledger, which is one of my favorite kind of recaps every week on what's going on in the music industry. But before we kind of jump into this, I want to mention Henry Droz from WEA, from that Warner Music Group. I had the pleasure of working with Henry, and he is really kind of the architect of modern day distribution. He was the one who decided that there would be regional offices across the country and regional teams, and that's what all the majors sort of modeled themselves after. And he has since passed away. I had so many great years and great conversations with Henry Droz and learned a lot from him. But another icon in that music business.
Again, and if you came into the business kind of in the last 20 years or so, you don't really get a view of how influential the Warner Music Group was. Which included the labels, of course, Warner Brothers, Elektra, and Atlantic. And top to bottom, that organization was they were really, the kind of the pinnacle in terms of, again, in terms of artist development and lots of
market
intangible
share,
things and market
talent.
Share.
They were the king of the hill for decades. Yes,
absolutely. And in fact, most of those iconic individuals that really were putting all of that big machine together have left us. They have gone on, and
sadly,
But I'm nothing but honored to have even just kind of hung with some of those people, as you just said, over the years. It's like
I think it's absolutely
really
amazing. So here are the stories. There was a series of stories in this deep dive, and let's just really quickly talk about maybe a little bit about each one, and then we'll dive in. The first one was the evolution and boom of music distribution, and they said that data and marketing are now part of the business of distribution, and that business is booming.
Absolutely. And of course, we talk so much about data and the plethora of information that you have to parse through, and it's so much to catch up on, to understand. And that is again one of the, you always got some data, right? You worked in distribution in the early days of your career. There was data that was parsed and talked about, but nothing on the order that we're talking about today.
No, we had data on sales. Typically it was CDs and vinyl and cassettes, and we'd get reports, and we set up these systems where on Street Date, our top reps that had the national accounts across the country would kind of type into a mainframe, what their sales were at, Musicland and Warehouse and Camelot and, all of that, Tower Records. And so we could see it that way on the physical side, but it was more complicated because there was the shipments, there was the returns, there were the sales, there was a lot in play there. Today with digital, we can see consumption basically live time, and it's changed the world.
Well, and it's not only, what has also changed, of course, and we talk a lot about it on this podcast, is the unbelievable throughput of new product coming into the marketplace around the clock, every second. there was a lot of product in our day at the beginning, a lot of physical product, but nothing on the order that we're talking about today. So it is, we couldn't have imagined a scenario like we have today, where we have all of these new tracks uploaded every day to all the DSPs, and it's stunning when you think about that. And that is more and more and more and more and more data that has to be kind of collected, parsed, exactly. So, but of course, the business is booming because of all of that input of material.
Right.
The distributors are making some fairly substantial bank.
Yeah, they're calling it a boom. You know, it was Matt Burns who co-founded Universal-owned InGrooves. He said it's fair to call it a boom. It's possible this might just be the beginning of a bigger boom. And I find that really interesting as well. You know,
hard to imagine a bigger boom, but it's probably likely, right?
Yeah. And, you know, Warner has ADA worldwide, and that's been around for almost 30 years, you know, which is like, you know, InGrooves or the Orchard. And, you know, they work with indie artists and labels. And Kat Creedick, you know, who is the president of ADA, said, you know, they're having a moment.
Right. And we kind of talk about, you know, we use the phrase the majors, which really is from an older era. But it's what's interesting to see is you've got Sony, you've got Warner's, you've got Universal. They've got their own internal distribution companies, but they also own other distribution platforms, which is pretty unique the way it's kind of, and not everything, you know, and not everything goes through one or the other. It's very interesting and complex how distribution has evolved from the beginning of our careers until where we are right now.
Right. And in one of the future pieces we're going to cover here in a couple minutes, a couple of people break this down, the different levels of distributors from DIY all the way, you know, to the majors. And I think that's really interesting. You know, this all came about, well, InGrooves started out, you know, just trying to answer the question, you know, how do you get from point A to point B? Meaning, how do you get a master song to Apple? You know, and so distribution's roles and responsibilities, even given what we've outlined, there's a lot to it. It's not so simple in encoding and delivering music and metadata accurately to, you know, so many DSPs globally, and then making sure that all of the accounting is taken care of properly, and you know, making sure that everything's being accounted for, but also up on these DSPs properly, and then solving those problems. It's not that distribution is more or less important. It's just different.
Way different. You know, they talk in here about one of the indie distributors, Create Music Group. They work with 25,000 artists and 2,500 labels. I mean, that's unheard of. I mean, but it was unheard of. It's not unheard of now, but that goes to show you the scope and the quantity that we're talking about. That how much product and relationships they have to manage. Yeah. It's such a higher order of magnitude than anything that we ever saw in the old music business. The new digital music business is just enormous.
Yeah. And before we jump to the next one, there's a piece, a paragraph in here that I thought was really interesting, where they had kind of asked the question, you know, why are distributors so crucial for major labels in the streaming era? And Darius Van Arman, who is the co-CEO of the Secretly Group, he said it's because distributors use longstanding connections and relationships to communicate with streaming services, physical retailers, radio stations, emphasizing certain tracks amid a fire hose of new releases. He said, with distributors, we have 2 hours with you, Spotify, this week. We're sending 1,000 releases your way, but we can't talk about all of them. So here's our priority. And I think that's really, really important, that when you have a distributor, whether it's a label that's acting as a distributor or one of these DIY, or whether it's, you know, these major indies, they can't pull the trigger on every single release and make it a priority. They have to prioritize by genre and mood every week for the digital service providers.
It's an enormous job. It really is. And when you're talking about, again, that use of the phrase of fire hose of new music coming in, again, we talk about it all the time, but it's an enormous amount of stuff that has to be dealt with in some way or not. And your distributor is the person that's going to do that. Remember, you can't load directly into Spotify. You have
you could for a moment, and that tees us up into this next piece because it talks about that. This is from Elias Light. Why streaming platforms are getting into distribution, right? And to your point, Spotify, jumped into it, but less than a year later, they jump back out. And there are people, platforms like TikTok and SoundCloud that are kind of venturing into, this market of distribution. In March, TikTok officially launched Sound On, and that was their distribution marketing services that we were reading about. TikTok's global head of music, Ol Obermann, said that the aim was to ensure that every aspiring musician in the world thinks, I want to start my musical career and journey, and I'm going to do it on TikTok. And I've had some really interesting conversations lately about TikTok because TikTok is kind of the pretty girl on the block right now, and there's some lazy A&R people who are only focusing on what's popping on TikTok. There's some label people that, not many, but there are some that are just focusing on grabbing the latest thing just so they can bump up their market share. And we won't get into the whole pro rata user-centric thing, but because the way that streaming pays out, it really helps them to have more market share. And I wonder if TikTok becomes a label and a distributor, then they're going to see earlier than anyone else what's starting to bubble up and pop, and they can grab it for themselves and monetize that. It makes for a real interesting situation.
It certainly does. But I think part of the gist of this particular section is folks at the existing longtime distributors seemed, many of whom, of course, are speaking on the condition of anonymity. They kind of view this with a bit of a shrug. It's like, it's like, okay, sounds good, says one veteran in the sector. But managers who want their artists to have as many options as possible, competition usually means more service for less commission, are more receptive. So, when you talk about the perspective of other competing distributors versus the perspective of an artist manager or an artist themselves, you can see the interest of being involved directly with TikTok. Absolutely. Absolutely. Will it last? I mean, if you look into your crystal ball, like you said, Spotify jumped in and then went, oh, I don't really want to be here. And then they jumped out.
Right. And we talk about SoundCloud here, right?
Yes.
Well, last week we talked about market share. SoundCloud is a rounding error compared to, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, some of these other platforms, even though they, I think most DSPs now have around 80 million tracks. And SoundCloud, I believe, is pushing closer to 300 million tracks.
Yes.
But the barrier to entry is so low there. Like you and I could record something on an iPad today and upload it onto SoundCloud, and we're off and running, right? And I think that because of that, they've got this massive size, and people want to be involved in that, thinking that that's also a massive audience. And I'm not saying that they don't have a strong audience, but SoundCloud has cut deals with like Lil Pump and Techno, and they used to work with major labels. When a streaming service with the reach and influence of SoundCloud or even TikTok, when they add distribution or let's say artist services, on paper that has the potential to be powerful. I just haven't seen it in practice yet. We're going to talk in a minute about DistroKid and how much, it's like 30 to 40% of the music uploaded every week, according to them, it goes through DistroKid. But you only have so many hours in a day and a limited staff. You can't, to the point earlier, you can't make 1,000 releases a week priority and give them marketing and targeted online advertising. It still has to be that top X% that's going to get that marketing push, adding gasoline to that fire. A lot of it, a friend of mine refers to as pipes. Some of these distribution platforms, they're just pipes. They get your music out there, but it's up to you to drive traffic and make people care.
Right. And we were talking a little bit about the old music business, and it's worth noting, here we've got this problem with all of this this voluminous amount of music being added every day. People rightly complain about the old music business, the major label thing with gatekeepers and all of that. But in those days, for the most part, a label would sign an act and they would put money into it. And then they would also give it maybe 1 or 2 or 3 additional albums to develop. And so as hard as it was to break into that system in the day, at least they did do what they should have done in most cases, in many cases, maybe not most, but in they would put money into it and try to develop artists. Right. And when you have this gigantic throughput right now of stuff coming in, it's really hard as consumers, obviously, to find the music that you're interested in. And it's really hard for distributors. Everybody throughout the chain is not necessarily doing what you should do for artist development. And because there's just so much stuff. And like you're talking about SoundCloud and all of the music that's on SoundCloud. But it's so easy to get up on SoundCloud. It's so easy to create music, not necessarily good music, but who's to decide what's good.
Right.
So all of these things we're talking about, when it's just such a gigantic amount of stuff. And it's really a tough business now.
Well, you talk about artist development, Mike, and that I remember when I was at Universal, Henry Droz and Jim Urey came over, and one of the first things they created was this saying and this artwork that said, we stand for artistry and artist development, and that was stressed at every meeting that we had, and it was really interesting that when there were releases coming out, we put together plans for all of those releases. And yes, you have to throw gasoline on the fire, when something starts to pop. But today it's a little bit more disposable. I think TikTok is interesting in that it reminds me of kind of these deals they used to have years ago where you would get 3 singles. I believe Travis Tritt's original deal was for 3 singles. And then they would work it at radio, and if it hit, then you'd have the right of first refusal to put out the album. And that's becoming pretty popular now. I was talking to an artist last week that has a deal with a label where it's 4 tracks a year. That's all he has to release. Has no mention of EPs or albums. And like we talked about last week, there are people that are popping, breaking out from TikTok who maybe haven't even completed writing an entire song. Maybe what's popping is a segment of a song, right? And maybe they haven't played a live show before. So when you talk about artist development, that takes time and it takes a little bit of money. And I'm not sure today that the artist development is taking place like it used to. I can tell you that at some of the best labels that we talk about, they still have dedicated staffs that are working on artist development, but it's not everywhere.
It's not everywhere. It is not everywhere. What's interesting, too, about the whole SoundCloud and TikTok thing is that, so TikTok's thing is called Sound On, but it's powered by TuneCore. One of the other distributors. So again, a lot of these things you're seeing these sort of hybrid kind of interesting combinations of companies that are doing things together, and that is a dramatic change from the way it used to be. So static in terms of you kind of knew where you stood, who was
maybe
the label,
siloed.
who was distributing,
and
it was siloed then, and it's so not siloed now.
No, because they're saying, let's go to where the party is, with Sound On. TikTok is not the distributor, that TuneCore, CD Baby, DistroKid, or any of those DIY kind of places are. They don't have the reach or the expertise there. And so these other distributors, they can make sure that this music gets on every DSP globally.
Right, exactly. But as we mentioned, you can kind of see, while some of the existing distributors are a bit skeptical about Sound On, again, if you're managing an artist, with a young act, it's pretty sexy to want to be with TikTok in any way you can be with TikTok. You know, the opportunity to work with TikTok was a no-brainer, one of the managers said. So, you know, how can you not, you know, will they be a super popular destination for this? Well, we'll see. We'll talk about it over the next several months for sure, and maybe in a year they will have decided like Spotify did to go, oh yeah, I'm not so sure we want to be doing this.
And I think the
It's
big
a lot
elephant,
of resources, it's a big commitment.
Yeah, I think the big elephant in the room is if you go through Sound On, will you have an edge at TikTok that the other artists won't? And I think that remains to be seen if that's the case. As we move forward, there's a couple of other pieces I want to touch on from this deep dive. These are all individual pieces. This is another one. You know, we talked about the Keith Bernstein story written by Kristen Robinson. She also wrote this piece for Billboard, and the headline is Picking the Right Distributor, 7 Tips for Indie Artists. And I go through this conversation every single week. There are certain distributors that you have to be invited to. There are certain ones, you know, that anyone can get on. And each distributor sort of has their strengths.
Yes.
You know, I know like In Grooves is killing it with Latin music. Symphonic their superpower is monetization, right? There's such great experience over, you know, at the Orchard. There's all sorts of places where you can distribute your music. And I really appreciate this piece because this is one of those I think I'm going to print out when I have those conversations because it really amplifies the message. And I'll kick it off with the first one. They say you need to know your needs before you sign up with a distributor. You know, you need to come to the table with what you've got, where you're at, and what you're willing to put into it. And I thought that was really interesting, just knowing what your needs are.
Absolutely. Of course, you have to pick a level of service based upon your needs. As we talked about and are talking about, not all distributors are created equally. You've got kind of basic distribution platforms like DistroKid, CD Baby, TuneCore. They basically upload, et cetera, and that's kind of it. Then you've got second-tier distributors like STEM, Level, and Sparta, which are more selective with the artists they take on as clients. They may do a little bit more. The third and more involved tier of distribution is often dubbed label services. Companies that are owned by major labels sometimes, which is like AWOL and The Orchard, Virgin Music Label and Artist Services, and In Grooves, ADA. All of those companies are, again, it's that kind of gray area. They are distributors, but they also do label services. And so you've got, you know, and as they say, the second and third tier, they're quite fluid, these tiers, what they offer. So you really have to kind of know what you're looking to do and who's doing what you want to do.
Yep. And the last thing I'll say on that kind of that third tier that you talked about is that some of them have in-house A&R teams that are scouting for talent as well. And sometimes they have, you know, sync teams. But you're going to pay more for that level of service. Those advances range from 10 to 25% of master royalties. And there are some joint ventures and some other things. But what you just laid out, those 3 tiers of distribution, if you don't take anything else out of this discussion, I think that is really key to your decision as an indie artist, you know, what distributor you should go for. The next point they make is that you should consider a partner that specializes in your genre. You know, we don't have to go too deep into this, but, you know, Empire, for example, is really known, you know, for urban hip hop. I mentioned ADA and their strength in Latin, you know, and then you just talked about TikTok's Sound On and SoundCloud's Repost, you know, those divisions, you know, that they've done pretty well with developing artists. So consider, you know, your partner in what their strengths are.
Yeah, indeed. One of the things they mentioned is avoid cold submissions, which of course basically is submission pages where you can share your work for consideration. Really avoid those, and then go with the distributor that cares. You know, kind of do a little research and see for a variety of reasons what they're into, and maybe they're into you. You know, you want your distributor to be enthusiastic about what you're doing. And
you know, you want
that's kind of hard. Yeah, you don't want ambivalence.
No, absolutely. You know, go where you're celebrated, not tolerated. I'm telling you, if you surround yourself with evangelists on any level, whether it's, you know, label, distribution, management, whoever it is, if you surround yourself with believers, evangelists that can't wait to help you out and use their relationships and their skills. That's where the magic happens. And just really to put a bow on this, they talk about, you can ask for payments directly from collaborators, and that's huge. Some distributors like STEM have a system to send royalty payments directly to the collaborators, which is really interesting. And then the last one is, some of them offer advances, but as they say in this piece, make sure that you have a good music industry attorney when you're starting to talk about advances.
Yes, you are. That's because things can go way sideways sometimes if you don't have that representation.
Yeah.
So, all good things. And, kind of like we've been talking about, it is really confusing. And if you just go to the landing page of any of these distributors, they're lovely, and it's feel good stuff, and it's like empowering.
Yeah.
But again, you got to do a little deeper dive to find out what their expertise is and what those kind of tiers that exist in this world of distribution. Is it a tier that matches what you're looking to do?
Yeah, and look at the artists that they have. I always tell people, look at the website, look at artists that you'd want to collaborate with, tour with, that you love the music of, or it feels like it's really close to what you're trying to do. You want to be with a distributor and a label for that matter that gets you, that understands your genre, your mood, your narrative, all of that. And again, if you do that, really great things will happen. So this is just an amazing deep dive into distribution. We encourage you to subscribe to Billboard Pro. This piece alone is worth the price of admission. And there's a piece that we won't go deep into, but they talk about who the top music distributors are and a little bit about what their strengths and weaknesses are. And they talk about some of the ones that we've mentioned here. There are a couple on there that you may never have heard of, but you should kind of dig through there because they talk about other artists that they have, maybe some management companies they work with, what their strengths and weaknesses are, that sort of thing. But, you and I have never really done an episode that was based on one article or one series of articles like this, but there was so much there that I felt like we really needed to focus a little bit on distribution this week. But just such great work from those guys over at Billboard this week. Amazing stuff.
And it really puts an exclamation point on, because you and I both came from being musicians, wanting to be signed or wanting to get that label deal or release an album or whatever. And, we live in miraculous times because it's, first of all, the tools to create music are so much cheaper. And then, we grew up in an era when you had to go to a recording studio and then to kind of get so you can record inexpensively, you can get your music out inexpensively, and you can get your music on Spotify, on Apple Music, everywhere inexpensively. It's unbelievable the opportunities that artists have now with all of these tools, all of these different flavors of distribution to get your product out. And it's fantastic, but with a big asterisk by that statement, it's a lot to learn and it's a lot to know and it's a lot to research. Yeah. And there are so many different overlapping things in this world. Again, the difference between a label and a distributor is very gray now.
Yeah.
It didn't really used to be.
It's fluid.
It's very fluid. So if you are that person, that artist that is looking to move into this direction or to find switch distributors or just for your first time relationship with a distributor, boy, you got to read through all of this stuff.
Great resource.
And learn the differences. Absolutely. Fantastic. Oh boy, Jay, it is dense. We had a great time. Kind of just, it was so much to read through and learn about. My knowledge has increased greatly over just the last couple of days as I was pouring through this stuff. What a great series!
Yeah,
tipping the hat to the kids over at Billboard, without a doubt. Yeah. And as we mentioned, that Billboard Pro subscription is really worth it. It is fantastic and
worth every penny.
Worth every penny. And as Jay and I wrap up this edition, I certainly want to thank our wonderful, wonderful sponsors that help us do this every week. Band Zoogle, our good friends at Hypebot and Bands in Town. Big thanks. And Jay, here we are. We're knocking down another episode, and we're going to crank out with another one next week. So we sure appreciate everyone listening into this week's episode. Big thanks to the folks over at Billboard again for putting this entire series together. It was fantastic. And on that note, Jay and I will see you next time on the Your Morning Coffee podcast.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.